Hello and welcome to this episode of Mrs. Mulvey's Math Movies. In this episode we're going to talk about writing conditional statements, the contrapositive, and the inverse. If you did not watch the first video in this series, you can use this information, the website tinyurl.com/mulveygeometryconditional. Watch that video first. So after you watch that video, then you can come back here. And we're going to start by talking about writing conditional statements. By writing conditional statements, I mean this. You're going to take a sentence and put it in the if-then form. For example, I've got this statement, a straight angle measures 180 degrees. It's a true statement, but we're going to write it as a conditional. In order to write it as a conditional, it needs to have an if part and a then part, as we talked about in my prior video. And so I'm going to start with my if part, the hypothesis. Instead of saying a straight angle, I'm going to say if an angle is a straight angle. Now I'll have the conclusion. I type the then, and I write then it measures 180 degrees. So it's simply taking the words and putting it in the if-then form, giving it a hypothesis and a conclusion. Let's try another one. So my statement is the windmill turns when the wind is blowing. If I want to turn this into a conditional, though, I want to note it and see what is dependent and what is independent. In this case, it's the wind blowing that turns the windmill. And so my hypothesis becomes this. If the wind is blowing. My conclusion, well, the hypothesis part is just the wind is blowing because the hypothesis follows if. But the first part of the statement would be if the wind is blowing, then, and the conclusion is the windmill turns. So sometimes as you write your conditional statements, it's important to know which part is actually conditional. And the windmill turning is conditional upon the wind blowing. So the hypothesis part is the wind is blowing, the conclusion is the windmill turns. Okay, so we've talked about writing conditional statements. Now we're going to talk about the contrapositive of conditional statements. In the last video we talked about the converse. Now we're going to talk about something that's the contrapositive. A contrapositive is when the hypothesis and the conclusion of a conditional statement are switched, so you're switching the order, and negated. And by negated I mean made the opposite in meaning. For example, let's take a look at this one. I have my conditional statement of if there is lightning, then there is thunder. In this original conditional statement, this is my hypothesis. I'm just going to use H for hypothesis, and this is the conclusion. For a contrapositive, I switch the hypothesis and conclusion, but I also negate them. In this case, negating it means giving it a not. And so to negate the statement there is thunder, I would say there is not thunder. But remember, I'm also switching the order. And so instead of just saying if there is thunder, because I'm negating it, I'm giving it a not, I'm going to say if there is not thunder, my hypothesis now becomes my conclusion. It goes behind the then, but I also need to negate it. So instead of saying there is lightning, I say then there is not lightning. So notice, I switch the hypothesis and conclusion, but I also negated each one by giving them the word not. So if my original statement is, if there is lightning, then there is thunder, the contrapositive becomes, if there is not thunder, then there is not lightning. Now the contrapositive is true. I'm sorry, not true. The contrapositive is important because of this one logical fact. If a statement is true, then its contrapositive is also true. The name that we give for that is that they are logically equivalent. So basically, if a statement is true, then its contrapositive is true. If a statement is false, then its contrapositive will also be false. They're logically equivalent. Whatever is true for one or false for one is true or false for the other as well. That is not the case for an inverse or a converse. So let's take a look at another example of writing a contrapositive. Here's a conditional statement. If I eat crackers, then I will be thirsty. So now we're going to write the contrapositive. I would like you to think about what you think the contrapositive would be. Take a moment, pause the recording. When you're ready, come back. So the contrapositive is where I switch the hypothesis and the conclusion and I negate them. So if I switch them and negate them, it becomes, if I will not be thirsty, then I will not eat crackers. So I switched the order of my hypothesis and conclusion and I negated them both. Let's take a look at another conditional statement. My conditional statement is, if it is not raining, then I am dry. So, for the contrapositive, I need to switch the order of the hypothesis and conclusion, and I need to negate each one. And by negating them, I mean changing I only want you to think of it as a sign. And so, when I switch the order, the I am dry becomes I am not dry. My hypothesis of it is not raining becomes the conclusion, but I negate it, and in this way I need to negate it by removing the not. Then it is raining. So I made it the opposite in meaning. That's what really negating means, making it the opposite in meaning. And so I switched the order and I negated each one. So my conditional statement was, if it's not raining, then I am dry. My contrapositive is, if I am not dry, then it is raining. So let's talk about the last topic we need to discuss, inverses. An inverse is when you keep the order the same, but negate both parts, the hypothesis and the conclusion. The inverse is when you negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion of a conditional statement. So let's take a look at these two conditional statements. My conditional was, if it eats cracker, okay, it does say it, I meant it to say I. Let me just fix that up. So my conditional statement was, if I eat crackers, then I will be thirsty. To write the inverse, I keep the order of the hypothesis and conclusion the same, except I negate each part. And so the inverse would be, if I do not eat crackers, then I will not be thirsty. So notice the order stayed the same, with changes that I negated each part. Let's look at the next conditional statement. If it is not raining, then I am dry. So to write the inverse, I negate each part. And so if it is not raining becomes if it is raining. The then I am dry becomes then I am not dry. So the order stayed the same, I just negated each one. And so that's it. That's the inverse and the contrapositive. Let me know if you have questions.